Hello everyone. Tonight, we drift together toward a hill that seems to breathe under the weight of centuries, where the earth keeps its own slow heartbeat and the air carries a hint of damp clay and lacquered wood. Lantern lightenly imagined, yet steady places small pools of amber on the ground within your mind, and the hush between those pools feels like water you could step across. You notice your own breathing before anything else, the way it lengthens when the world grows quiet, the way your shoulders soften when nothing asks to be done. The soil has a cool fragrance, almost metallic at the edge, like rain that never quite falls. Somewhere in this stillness, the faintest rattle of a chime would be thunder. You and I take a step, and then another, and the darkness does not resist us. It simply reshapes around our outlines, as if it had been expecting us all along. The shape we approach is not merely a tomb on a map. It is a choice that an age once made about how memory should be stored sealed, layered, and hidden, so that only patience can find it. We move as though along a buried corridor, palms open to catch the breath of air that seems to seep from stone. You may feel a quiet pressure at the ears, as if the ground itself had a secret to whisper but preferred to test your silence first. In places like this, you might not even survive the silence of these halls, unless you learn to be as gentle as the dust. The world beyond is full of noise and light, but here, the past requests softer footsteps. If you like traveling this way slowly, carefully, with the night as our guide, you can like and subscribe so that our meetings find you again when the lamps are low. Tell us, too, where you are listening from and what time it is there. A kitchen in Chicago at Muimot Baype. Blady. A quiet bedroom in Dallas at Moat, Muibone. Blady. A small balcony where the traffic has finally thinned your moments become part of the path we follow. When many people walk softly together, even a sealed door can feel less heavy. We let our senses lead. Imagine a chamber designed to hold not only precious objects, but an idea of the world, constellations drawn in darkness, tiny horizons painted on surfaces that never see the sun. Some say that maps shine beneath the earth like sheets of dimmed silver, and that guardians wait without needing breathe ease patient, hands at the ready, their stillness a form of watching. You and I do not pry at edges. We trace them with thought. We notice how the notion of power rearranges space, how distance grows around a single name, how stairways widen for a single pair of footsteps, how rooms are tuned for one listener alone. In such arrangements, even whispers grow careful. The past learns to speak through symbols because faces cannot come forward. And yet, beyond the idea of a ruler and the hush of buried corridors, something else lingers in the air, something that smells faintly of hair oil and silk warmed by body heat, of cosmetics in wooden jars, of notes written and then folded away. The palace was once full of women who moved like dawn and dusk through the same rooms. Stories say that when the night finally closed its hands, some of those footsteps did not leave the hill. Their names, once bright on brushes and fans, faded into the soil's memory. We will not turn their quiet into harshness. We will listen for them in the way the earth settles, in the way an imagined sleeve brushes an unseen wall, in the way a secret can be kept for so long that keeping becomes its only form of breathing. So we stand here at the beginning together, you and I, with the lamps turned down in our minds and the path uncoiling in a line that feels both new and very old. We will walk beside hidden stairwells and sealed doors. We will consider the shape of power as it sleeps, and we will hold carefully the thought that human lives, delicate and complete, may have been gathered into this quiet, the way petals are gathered into a book, to keep their color. The question before us is not merely what was built, or even why it was sealed, but what kind of silence follows great plans when the world goes dark. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a gentle background noise, and let's begin our journey together tonight. The land itself felt younger once, though still carrying the scent of stone and riverbanks. You and I can almost hear the murmur of carts rolling along packed earth. the steady rhythm of sandals and hooves marking out the breadth of an empire that was just learning how wide its shoulders could be. Villages rested close to streams that doubled as mirrors for the sky, and in the evenings, smoke curled up from clay chimneys like soft signals, each one saying, "We are here. We are safe. For now." Imagine the fragrance of millet simmering, the flicker of oil lamps on low tables, the press of families who measured time not with calendars, but with the way the sun bled over rooftops. In this society, the idea of order grew like bamboozle, straight and unbending. The first emperor's hand could be felt even in the smallest details, weights aligned, measures corrected, scripts unified, so that a single brushstroke meant the same from mountain to coast. It was a vast weaving, one in which every knot tied tighter the cloth that covered the realm. And yet, under such cloth, people whispered. They whispered about laws that were as sharp as knives hidden in silk. They whispered about punishments that arrived like sudden storms, washing away names as if they had never existed. Still, life had its gentler currents, two festivals, where lanterns glowed like captive suns, markets that buzzed with chatter, the laughter of children chasing painted kites, until the sky seemed full of creatures no one had ever seen. Step with me deeper into this memory, stone walls rising, not to keep you out, but to remind you how small footsteps can sound when a ruler dreams on a scale larger than rivers. These walls, these roads, these straight lines across Valley Seach was a sentence written not with ink, but with human effort. And people obeyed, because to resist was to risk, not just silence but vanishing. The air itself seemed to learn discipline. Even the wind bent around the new order. Yet, when dusk came, families still leaned close around fires, telling each other stories that softened the day, their voices curling upward like threads of incense. If you listen carefully, you might hear the difference between surface stillness and hidden pulse. The empire looked calm, unified, strong, but beneath, hearts carried questions. What does it mean to belong so completely to one man's vision? What is lost when every melody must harmonize to a single note? These questions did not rise in open argument. They drifted quietly, like seeds carried by the breeze, finding their places in shadows where roots might someday grow. And so, the stage was set not with the roar of drums, but with the hush of millions moving in rhythm, their lives woven into a pattern they could not wholly see. It is from this fabric of discipline and quiet wonder, of awe and unease, that the next chapters would rise. For the tomb we imagine tonight was born not only of stone and treasure, but of a society trained to carve permanence out of dust. And yet, behind the stillness, something gentle was beginning to shift. The palace waited like a heart behind layers of walls, each gate a breath drawn inward, each courtyard a pause before another secret. You and I can feel the change in air as we step closer, incense curling more heavily, polished floors reflecting lanterns like pools of captured fire, corridors that seem to lean toward our shoulders. It was here that youth was gathered, sifted, and shaped, like clay pressed into molds designed not for comfort but for permanence. Imagine a young figure approaching uncertain steps, eyes lifted to roofs that soared like frozen waves, ears learning the language of whispers long before they learned the language of command. The first emperor had once been a child of divided states, and the memory of that fractured world lingered in him like an echo that never fully faded. To enter the palace as a youth was to inherit not just marble floors and silken screens, but a legacy of suspicion, a belief that survival meant mastering silence before sound. Even the laughter of children in such halls could be trimmed, polished, made to sound less like joy and more like duty. You and I notice how the air here carried not only the fragrance of perfumes and lacquered wood, but also the faint sting of watchfulness, as though even the walls themselves listened. Within these chambers, youth was taught to move with restraint. Every glance became a sentence, every pause a calculation. To be near the throne meant to learn the rhythm of power, the way it could shift like light through lattice windows, casting shapes that vanished when you tried to hold them. Friends could become rivals in the space between two heartbeats, Allies could dissolve into shadows before dawn. And so, those who entered young were trained not in games of chance, but in games of silence. A dropped sleeve, a half smile, a glance withheld each became a message more enduring than words. But imagine, too, the innocence that survived despite this training. A child watching the carp in the palace ponds, tracing ripples with a fingertip, a young voice humming an old folk tune before realizing the note had wandered too far down a corridor. These fragments of youth clung stubbornly, like blossoms caught in the folds of robes. And yet, the palace was patient. It knew how to press such softness flat until only memory remained. The emperor's own youth, shadowed by the weight of unification, meant that his palace would always echo with both triumph and unease. To live within it was to feel the closeness of eternity at one's shoulder. Even the young learned quickly that they were not playing within walls, but walking across the first lines of a story that would end in soil, stone, and silence. Their steps rehearsed the rituals of power long before they understood the price of it. And as you and I move quietly with them, tracing their journeys through half-lit corridors, we sense how the palace itself became a teacher. It taught not with tenderness, but with echoes that demanded answers, with stillness that measured every breath. And in that stillness, something more was waiting, something that would draw these youths deeper into chambers where loyalty would be tested, and where hearts might be folded away as neatly as silk garments placed in cedar chests. And yet, behind the stillness, something gentle was beginning to shift. The harem opened like a garden at midnight, its blossoms unseen yet heavy with fragrance. You and I step softly along corridors that shimmer with silk screens, each painted with cranes or peonies, each concealing more than it reveals. Inside, women moved like shadows, scented with jasmine, their laughter muted, their steps practiced until even the rustle of a sleeve became a language. This was not merely a place of beauty, it was a labyrinth of waiting, where affection was measured in glances granted or withheld, and futures could vanish like smoke from a bronze lamp. Imagine the hush of chambers lit by oil, the walls painted with scenes of mountains and rivers to soothe eyes that rarely saw the world beyond. Young concubines, chosen for their grace, learned quickly that survival meant not only pleasing the emperor, but also outlasting the rivalries of those around them. Their voices, soft as strings of a zither, could carry daggers sharper than steel. Gifts exchanged in daylight, an embroidered fan, a jade hairpin might by night carry the weight of alliances and betrayals. You and I pause near a screen where two women whisper. Their words drift like the smoke of incense, curling and blending, until no one could tell where loyalty ended and envy began. The emperor's presence was both blessing and storm. When he entered, the entire garden seemed to bloom at once, perfume stronger, smiles brighter, eyes lowered more deeply. But when he left, silence fell like dew, and that silence was often sharper than his gaze. Each woman dreamed of being remembered, of her face engraved into memory, like a seal pressed into clay. Yet the truth of the harem was that memory faded quickly, and those left behind might become as invisible as dust along the floor. Still, the promise of closeness to the throne was enough to keep hope alive, even when that hope burned low as a dying wick. And then, there were the whispers of what would come after death. Stories hinted that the emperor's secrets were so heavy they could not be trusted to air alone. Women who had once smiled at lantern festivals might one day find themselves sealed into chambers, their lives pressed into silence so that the emperor's story could remain unbroken. Whether such whispers were warnings or simply shadows of fear, they drifted among the courtyards like unseen winds, shaping every gesture with a quiet urgency. To love here was to risk becoming a footnote erased before it was ever read. Still, within this tension, moments of tenderness bloomed. A concubine tracing poems onto another's palm with her fingertip, knowing the strokes would fade before they were finished. The sharing of an orange in winter, its sweetness a reminder of the world outside walls. These delicate moments shimmered like fireflies in a night garden brief, fragile, but enough to remind each heart that life was more than waiting. You and I lean closer, listening not only to rivalry, but also to the sighs of friendship, the small rebellions of affection, hidden beneath layers of protocol. And yet, behind the stillness, something gentle was beginning to shift. Beyond the veils of perfume and laughter, the palace always led back to politics. As a river leads inevitably to the sea, you and I feel the corridors lengthen now, less perfumed, more solemn-lined with carved beams and scrolls of law rather than painted flowers. The air grows heavier with ink and cedar, the fragrance of decisions written down to outlast their makers. Outside, the chambers of the harem, the emperor's world was carved in edicts, seals pressed into clay, and voices that bent like reeds depending on the current of his will. Imagine the court assembled at dawn, ministers in long dark robes, their faces a mixture of reverence and calculation. The clatter of jade pendants against belts created a rhythm as precise as any drum. Words here were not simply spoken, they were balanced, measured, weighed against consequences unseen. You and I notice how silence became as potent as speech, how a pause could shift the meaning of an entire decree, how the lowering of one man's eyes might signal the fall of another. To return to this sphere of politics after the hush of the harem was to step into a storm disguised as ceremony. The emperor himself was both center and shadow. His gaze could make a hall of hundreds fall still. His gestures carried through the empire, like ripples spreading across a pond. Advisors debated the building of walls, the punishment of rebels, the distribution of grain. Yet beneath every argument lay a deeper truth. Each man feared the weight of being remembered for the wrong reason. In such a place, ambition cloaked itself in loyalty, and loyalty was often measured by how quickly one erased a rival's name. Whispers spread like smoke along the colonnades, drifting into chambers where decisions lingered long after words had faded. And in this court, the tomb was always present, though unspoken, though unseen. The emperor's plans for eternity shaped his choices in life. Resources were commanded not only for roads and armies, but for chambers beneath the earth, where silence would guard what time could not. Some officials knew, some guessed, and some pretended ignorance, but all understood that secrecy was itself a form of rule. You and I walk among them, sensing how glances tightened whenever the subject drew near, how even the ink on decrees seemed to darken when touched by the thought of death prepared in advance. Returning to politics after the softness of the harem was like waking from a dream to find the world already decided. Those who moved closest to the throne carried both honor and peril. One wrong phrase could see them vanish, not only from court, but from history itself. Still, they came. Each dawn, robes whispering, hearts pacing in rhythm with the emperor's breath. They came because power, even when it frightened, still pulled like gravity. And so, the palace revealed itself as two faces of the same coin, one gilded with silk and song, the other etched with ink and fear. Both faces served the same figure, the same dream of control that reached from daylight into eternity. The court hummed with tension that never resolved, each decision echoing down corridors and into the soil, where the tomb slowly took shape. And yet, behind the stillness, something gentle was beginning to shift. The path to power was not a straight road, but a winding ascent paved with both stone and silence. You and I can feel the incline beneath our feet, as we imagine how each step carried the emperor further from the common earth and deeper into a realm where every glance, every decree, every hesitation shaped the lives of millions. Power here was not granted. All at once it grew like ivy, climbing slowly, entwining itself around walls until no stone could be seen without it. Think of the years after unification. Kingdoms once divided, now bound into one empire. Roads stretched across valleys, walls coiled like dragons along ridges, and every traveller carried the weight of a new script, a single coinage, a single law. This was the emperor's path, crafted not just with vision, but with relentless insistence that the world must narrow into his image. You and I sense how exhausting such certainty could be. To believe the entire realm should breathe with one rhythm was to carry a burden no shoulders were truly meant to hold. Yet he held it, and others bore the cost. Power demanded both grandeur and fear. On one hand, monuments rose, projects that glittered with ambition, palaces where columns soared like trees of stone, mausoleums where entire armies of clay were sculpted to kneel forever in loyalty. On the other hand, whispers grew, stories of harsh laws, of names erased quietly, of families undone in silence, so that obedience would remain absolute. These whispers spread like smoke, never grasped, but always present, curling around conversations at night, drifting into the dreams of those who wondered how long such order could last. And then, the question of death pressed more urgently. For what is power if it cannot continue? The emperor's thoughts bent ever more toward the unseen horizon, where life ended, but authority need not. He searched not only in scholars' texts but in mountains and seas, listening for echoes of immortality. Alchemists promised elixirs. Emissaries returned with tales of islands, where death was only a rumor. Though none could prove their truth, each promise fed the same hunger, that his command might stretch beyond the years, that the hand which unified the realm might also hold eternity. Yet, even as these dreams of permanence grew, so too did the shadows they cast. For every chamber built beneath the earth, labourers vanished into fatigue. For every whisper of elixirs, there were murmurs of deception. Still, the emperor pressed forward, convinced that destiny bent for those who dared. The path to power had become a path beyond power, a road leading not only through palaces and courts, but into the silence of the afterlife itself. And so, you and I walked beside him in imagination-heavier robes with each step, corridors narrowing until only his vision could pass through. Around him, the world adjusted, bent, obeyed. Behind him, silence gathered like water pooling in shadow. Ahead of him, eternity seemed to beckon with both promise and threat. And yet, behind the stillness, something gentle was beginning to shift. The height of power felt like standing on a mountain at night, where the air is thin and the stars seem both close and cold. You and I can almost sense the emperor at this summit, robes heavy with the weight of an empire that stretched farther than his ancestors had dared to dream. Roads carried his will to distant provinces. Rivers bore his grain. Walls stood like vast stone sentences declaring that his rule would not be undone. In these years, his word was law, not only in palaces, but in fields, in markets, in the lives of countless families who would never see his face but lived beneath his shadow nonetheless. Imagine the court at this peak, ministers bowing lower, voices more cautious, decrees carved with sharper precision. The empire breathed in rhythm with a single heart. Bronze bells rang not only to mark time, but to remind the people that time itself had been gathered into his grasp. The dream of permanence grew brighter. The tomb rose in silence, chamber by chamber, as artisans shaped armies of clay, as if clay could march in the next world, as surely as flesh did in this one. You and I walk in those silent workshops, hearing only the scrape of chisels, the soft sigh of brushes painting armor that would never see battle, and we feel how devotion became indistinguishable from fear. At the height of power, even nature seemed to bend. Rivers were diverted, mountains cut through, forests felled to build roads wide enough for armies and dreams alike. To the emperor, the empire was not yet finished, it was always becoming, always needing more stone, more hands, more silence. And yet, this very height carried its own fragility. For above every summit stretches the sky, vast and indifferent. The people who once marveled at order began to feel the cost. Their fields grew lighter from labor demanded, their voices hushed, not by awe but by exhaustion. Still, obedience held. like silk stretched tight, gleaming but delicate. The harem too reflected this pinnacle. Where once rivalries whispered, now resignation lingered. Concubines adorned themselves in silks that glowed under lantern light. Yet some knew their beauty was less for celebration than for permanence, in stories they would never tell. Rumors spread of those who would not see freedom beyond the emperor's death, that their lives, too, were woven into his eternity. Whispers of burial drifted through the chambers, like the faint smoke of extinguished candles. Never spoken aloud, but always present, always near. And the emperor himself, surrounded by walls, guarded by soldiers, advised by ministers who measured each word. He seemed both invincible and alone. Power, at its height, is as isolating as it is commanding. The mountain peak offers vision in every direction, but no companions to share it. You and I watch him pace beneath painted ceilings, his thoughts stretching farther than the walls, farther than his years, reaching always toward what lay beyond death. Even in triumph, his gaze turned toward eternity, as though victory in life were only a doorway. And so, at the very summit, where the empire gleamed brightest, the shadows lengthened. For every lantern, there was a corner of darkness. For every decree, there was an unspoken doubt. The height of power was not the end of ascent, but the beginning of its descent. And yet, behind the stillness, something gentle was beginning to shift. Decline does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it begins as a faint dimming of lanterns, a hesitation in footsteps across marble floors. You and I can feel it here. In the corridors that once rang with confidence, but now seem to echo longer, emptier. The emperor's power, though still vast, began to press more heavily on those beneath it. Farmers bent longer over their fields. Soldiers marched farther from their homes. Artisans carved and painted until their hands stiffened like the clay they shaped. What once felt like unity began to taste of burden, and whisper soft, hesitant spread like smoke curling beneath a door. The emperor himself, restless in his strength, reached more urgently for secrets of immortality. Alchemists promised potions. Emissaries spoke of islands across the sea, where death was only rumor. Cups of mercury and elixirs of strange minerals were pressed to his lips in hopes of stealing years from time itself. You and I sensed the quiet dread of those who served him, knowing that these remedies glowed with danger, yet no one dared refuse. Even as he sought eternity, his body betrayed him, faltering steps, nights unsettled, a face that grew tighter around the eyes. Power, which once seemed boundless, began to show its cracks. Among the people, unease swelled, taxes bit deeper, conscriptions spread wider, and families felt the emptiness of sons and brothers taken for endless projects. Roads and walls, mausoleums and palaces, they rose like monuments, but each stone was a weight carried from the shoulders of countless lives. Markets still bustled, but laughter grew thinner, voices quieter, as if joy itself had learned caution. You and I walk through a village at dusk. The smell of millet porridge hangs in the air. Children chase shadows with sticks, yet their parents glance toward the horizon where imperial messengers might appear, knowing that summons meant more loss. In the palace, the harem lived under its own shadow. Stories spread dark, unconfirmed, that some among them would not live beyond the emperor's death, that they were destined to be sealed with him, as silent guardians of secrets never meant for daylight. Concubines who once smiled beneath lanterns now lowered their eyes more deeply, as though hiding from a fate they could not escape. The very walls seemed to listen, storing their sighs, their unfinished poems, their hopes folded away like silk never worn. And still, the emperor pressed forward. His tomb expanded, chambers layered deeper, guardians sculpted taller. To him, the silence of eternity was not an ending, but a continuation, and he demanded loyalty even from those who would not see the sun again. Yet the irony lingered. The higher his reach, the more fragile his hold. For power stretched too far begins to thin, and silence demanded too sternly. begins to tremble with echoes. You and I pause here, sensing the quiet weight of a world straining under its own monument. The decline was not collapse, but exhaustion, the slow settling of dust, the bowing of shoulders, the fading of voices once eager to follow. And in that exhaustion, history itself began to shift, preparing to carry the story forward without the hand that had once written it so firmly. And yet, behind the stillness, something gentle was beginning to shift. The legacy of the first emperor did not end with the closing of his eyes. It lingered, like incense that continues to drift long after the flame has gone out. You and I can almost feel that moment when his body was carried toward the tomb, silken wrappings layered carefully, jade ornaments placed upon his form, attendants moving with hushed precision. Outside, the empire still bowed to his name, but within, uncertainty swelled like a tide beneath the surface. Death had finally reached the man who sought to master even silence, and in doing so, revealed the limits of every hand that grasps too tightly. The tomb itself became his final command. Beneath the earth, chambers stretched wide and deep, painted with constellations that no longer shone above, rivers of mercury flowing as if to mimic seas. The clay army stood in perfect formation, tens of thousands of faces staring forward with eternal patience. Each soldier was unique, as though artisans tried to capture life itself before surrendering it to stillness. And yet, the most haunting whispers were not of soldiers or treasures, but of women. Stories said that concubines who once laughed under lanterns were sealed within, their voices hushed forever to keep the secrets of the emperor unbroken. Some believed they were buried alive, their beauty pressed into silence so that no rival hand or ear could betray what was meant to remain hidden. We cannot know each name, cannot trace each gesture, but we can imagine the sorrow folded into those stones. Lives gathered like offerings, not for the gods, but for one man's vision of eternity. You and I stand quietly at the edge of this thought, the weight of it pressing like soil against the chest, the realization that power demanded not only obedience in life but also sacrifice in death. Still, in that sacrifice lies a truth about humanity, that memory often carries not only glory but grief, not only triumph but shadows. And yet, even as silence filled the tomb, the world outside refused to stand still. The dynasty that the emperor carved with iron and fear faltered swiftly after his passing. Ministers quarreled, heirs struggled, rebellions stirred like restless winds. The same empire that had seemed unbreakable began to crack, its unity trembling as if the hands that once bound it had released their grip. The great wall still stretched, the tomb still held, but the people moved forward, carrying both scars and lessons. His legacy, then, was twofold: a vision of strength and permanence, and a warning of how fragile permanence truly is. For us, walking together tonight, the story does not end with a sealed chamber. It lives in the questions we carry. What is the cost of control? What do we owe to memory? And what must we release to time? The emperor's dream of eternity remains locked beneath soil, yet its echoes reach us, reminding that power can build roads, unify scripts, and raise armies. But it cannot silence forever the voices of those whose lives were gathered into its shadow. When you think of power, do you imagine fear, or perhaps silence? If you'd like to continue these journeys together, you know what to do. But for now, may sleep carry you gently through the night,